This story takes place on the island of Borneo, in Indonesia. It is a story of a return to life in the wild for 3 captive sun bear cubs. Bun Bun, a little girl. Bernie, another girl. And Wawa, a boy. Three orphans that I took under my care, accompanied and filmed. Sometimes I filmed myself with the bears to capture the bliss we were living. It all began with a cub called Windy. She had been captured from the wild at a very young age and was brought to a refuge for orangutans in Borneo. I was in the same refuge at the time she arrived, filming a documentary on deforestation. Windy was gentle and playful. I took care of her for several weeks and grew fond of her. But then the time came for me to move on. I left the refuge to pursue my film work and live my life. 5 years later, back in Indonesia, I was told that Windy had been transferred to a zoo. In her cage, the innocent little cub had become stressed and unhappy. I'd hoped for a better future for Windy. Like so many bears, she had been imprisoned since her childhood. Like so many bears, she will never climb a tree, never feel the soft forest floor under her feet, never even smell the scents of the forest. In all her life, she will never know a single moment of freedom. Sun bears are born to live in large areas of tropical rainforest. When deprived of everything, some break down and lose their minds. Five years after my first encounter with Windy, fate repeated itself with another sun bear cub that peasants had brought in from their village and handed over to the same rescue center where I once again happened to be. She was a girl that I named Bun Bun. I now knew exactly what fate awaited Bun Bun if I were to pursue my path and leave her behind. So this time, I decided to stay. And I promised her that I would give her back her freedom. But this was more easily said than done. Bun Bun would have little chance of surviving if I simply released her somewhere. She was too small to fend for herself. I would have to bring her to the forest and stay with her until she grew fully independent. Bun Bun was growing quickly, and I tried to keep up by building her bigger and bigger cages. But after a few months, I finally found the perfect home we could go to. A national park of lush rainforest with a camp deep within the park, where forest guards were posted and where I could stay. All we needed to do was go there. For the first few days, I kept Boon Boon in her cage to familiarize her with the smells and sounds of the forest. Then I let her out for the first time. Boon Boon was born in the forest, but she'd spent her childhood in cages. She was now about a year old, and these were her first steps on the soft forest floor. These were her first steps to freedom, her first steps toward reclaiming her identity. For me, it was also my first steps as a bear walker. It took Boon Boon only a few minutes to blend into her new environment. She plunged into a world of scents and flavors and set off to explore. For Boon Boon, everything was both new and familiar. She was discovering the forest, or rather, rediscovering the forest. She was finding her world and its inhabitants. She was becoming a bear again. My role was to stay with Boon Boon to protect her. My presence was enough to chase away any wild bear that could want to harm her, or predators like the clouded leopard. Boon Boon let herself be guided by the smells of the forest, but she never wandered too far, as my presence reassured her. Normally, sun bear cubs stay with their mother until they're about 2 years old, at which point they slowly establish independence. Boon Boon stayed by me like she would have done with her own mum. As the days and weeks went by, Bun Bun was more and more blissful. Her expressions, the way she moved her lips, the way she held her head, said a lot about the happiness she was experiencing. She was active from dawn to dusk, always busy and on the move, curious about everything. She was completely involved in whatever she was doing. Then she would suddenly move on to the next thing with the same intensity, and so on until the end of the day. She never stopped. Despite her many discoveries during the day, Bun Bun was not able to satisfy her appetite. And every late afternoon, driven by hunger, she would gladly go back to camp and into her cage, where food awaited her. After dinner, it was bonding time, and then I would lock her in her cage for the night. I too had my quarters for the night that I shared with some friends. I had a roof, food and water. I needed nothing else. There in the forest, I was living the happiest days of my life. When I opened my eyes in the early mornings to the call of the gibbons, I was the happiest man on earth, because I was going to spend my day walking in the forest with a bear. A dream, but a very real one. The more that time went by, the more I felt bonded to Bun Bun. Seeing her grow, seeing her gain in confidence, I was completely dedicated to her emancipation. I was experiencing the joy of giving everything to a child. My life had a meaning, a very real one, that of caring for Bun Bun and seeing her through to adulthood. It was the most compelling, beautiful task I'd ever given myself. Each day spent in the forest was a victory for us. Bun Bun could still have been in a cage somewhere, but instead of that, she was spending another day of freedom in a complex and stimulating environment. Her blossoming was my happiness. I love the way Bun Bun belonged to the forest. They were both made for one another. They were both in perfect harmony. The forest made Bunbun's beauty come out, wrapping her in bliss. Despite my complete immersion in the forest, I could not avoid having to handle some administrative obligations, and on the third month I had to go away for a few days. I left Bunbun under the care of my friends at the camp. They were good with animals, and I knew that she trusted them. I'd suggested that they let Bunbun out of her cage during my absence. I was confident that she would stay in the vicinity and would come back for supper in the evenings, like she'd done every day. But Bunbun went away and did not return. I hurried back to the site. I went out looking for her day after day, week after week. I called her name everywhere in the forest, but my worry and my tears did not make any difference. Bunbun had vanished. I fear that in my absence, Bunbun had felt abandoned and had gone off looking for me. But she was not yet fully independent. She should have come back to the camp when she got hungry. In her quest for food, she might have gone toward human settlements, where she could have been captured or killed. So I continued my search for Bunbun in the villages bordering the forest. I met many lives, stolen away, taken hostage, even other sun bears, but it was never her. I had lost Bunbun, but they had lost everything. In my search, I was both somewhat relieved to not find Bunbun, but sad to discover so many captive animals in such pitiful conditions. I did not find Bunbun, but I discovered Bernie, a small female cub only a few months old. She was a victim of the illegal animal trade, confiscated by authorities and placed in a rescue center. Bernie was still very young and could thus go back to the wild if someone gave her the opportunity. But if no one did, she was going to spend the rest of her life behind cage bars. With the approval of the people responsible for the refuge, I decided there and then to take Bernie under my care and bring her to the forest. But this time, I promised myself that I was not going to lose her. First step, I had to go back to my country to prepare for my new trip to the forest. I decided to equip Bernie with an implant placed in the abdominal cavity. This tracking device would emit a radio signal over a 300-yard radius for 3 years. Thanks to the implant, I would be able to find Bernie wherever she hid. After 3 months of preparation, I went back to Indonesia to meet up with Bernie. When I got to the rescue center, another sun bear cub had arrived, a boy called Wawang. He was older than Bernie, but still young enough to go back to the forest. It was then that I adopted 2 cubs. Luckily, I'd brought 2 implants, so each bear could have their own. I spent a few weeks with Bernie and Wawang in their cage to gain their trust. And once we had all bonded, we set out for the forest. At first, I was worried about caring alone for 2 cubs at once. I was afraid they would go off in their own direction, but luckily, they always stayed together. Wawang had grown up in a small cage in a private house, and at 1.5 years old, he was already a big boy. He was so happy to be in the forest. He just wanted to play from morning to evening. When Bernie let him understand that she'd had enough, he went off to play on his own. The forest for Wawang was like a huge playground. He was always so joyful. I called him Mr. Happy. Wawang had so much stamina that Bernie sometimes found it difficult to keep up. Still at an age of cuddles, she was no match for her brother's boisterous energy. Despite her young age, she had a strong personality, and she knew exactly what she wanted. She was more serious and mature than her older brother. Of us three, it was almost always Bernie who decided what we did next. Bernie would lead the way, Wawang would follow her, and I would follow Wawang. We were a strange party in the forest, a rather peculiar family. It was fortunate that Bernie and Wawang could discover together life in the forest. They were like best friends and benefited from one another. Bernie, more resourceful and curious, led the way, and Wawang, older and always happy, comforted Bernie in her moments of need. Bernie was still so little, she probably missed her mother. Once again, fate played its cruel hand. After just 6 weeks, our blissful existence came to a violent end. In the late afternoon, as we were slowly making our way back to camp, an unknown danger caught the attention of both Bernie and Wawang. Before I could understand what was happening, they had run off. I tried to follow them, but very quickly they were out of range of the tracking device, and night was closing in. I decided to wait for them at camp, feeling fairly confident that they'd return at night. But neither of them came back. The next morning, I managed to catch their radio signal and followed it to Wawang's body, lifeless. I could see from his wounds that he'd been killed in a fight with another bear. Bernie was alive, but hiding. She'd taken refuge in a tree and was too scared to come down. I buried Wawang's body and tried my best to comfort Bernie. I knew that the risk of a fight with a wild bear was serious, but I didn't think it would lead to death on the first encounter. I knew I couldn't blame the bear who had killed Wawang. For most animals of the forest, life is very hard. Deforestation is everywhere, and those who manage to survive find themselves in the small pockets of forest, competing for the same resources. The bear who killed Wawang was just fighting for his own survival. Wawang's death was a blow. But even if it was just for 6 weeks, he had at least known the forest and a family. With Bernie and me, Wawang had no doubt spent the happiest days of his life. He died, still a teenager, but he died as a bear, free and in the forest. After Wawang's death, Bernie grew closer to me and I to her. We both, each in our own way, grieved Wawang. Our dear friend had died under the claws of a wild bear, but Bernie had been spared. She had just gone through a traumatic experience, but she was alive and now better prepared for her future encounters with other bears. And I was there for her more than ever. So come what may, we were going to overcome our grief and pursue her path to adulthood together. The days and weeks passed, and happiness was once again with us. In the late afternoons, Bernie would still go back to camp for supper, but I didn't lock her in at night anymore. the door of her cage was left open, and Bernie chose to sleep wherever she pleased. In the mornings, I would usually find her in a tree close to camp, and we would go off together for another day in the forest. Bernie was completely free now, day and night, and she loved it. The more time went by, the larger Bernie grew, the harder it was for me to follow her. She could be by my side, then 10 minutes later, out of range of the tracking device. At the end of the first year, I spent long hours in the forest, just waiting for Bernie to come back, because I had no idea where she had gone. However, I was never truly alone. One familiar presence was an orangutan named Bagor. He'd also been taken captive as a young child. Originally placed in a rescue center, he was later released back in the forest some 10 years ago. Little by little, he managed to make a place for himself, and he was now the dominant male in the neighborhood. Bagor was used to seeing me with Bernie. It was always a pleasure to stumble across him. Bernie was like fascinated by Bagor. It was always her who went to him, who invited him to play or teased him. And Bagor was always benevolent with Bernie. As a dominant male, he was mostly alone and feared by the other orangutans. So I think he was quite amused by Bernie's company. Orangutans and sun bears have been sharing the same habitat for millions of years. Their history is not one of predator and prey, but one of peaceful cohabitation. Perhaps in the rainforests of Indonesia, friendships like that between Bagor and Bernie have existed for a very long time. Time went by, and Bernie became increasingly independent. She would go away for a few days and then come back to pick up the routine of her daily walks. At the end, her outings could last up to 3 weeks. Bernie could now find enough food to sustain herself. She was living her own adventures, taking her own decisions out there in the forest. She was leading her bear life in the world she belonged to. As for me, I didn't try to follow her or look for her in the forest anymore. I just waited for her at camp. Bernie didn't need me anymore, but she did come back every now and then. Her visits always began with a hearty meal. Then she liked to stay for a while and share with me a moment of tenderness. Shortly after this cuddle, Bernie left and did not return. Then I too left the camp and the forest. Since, my friends at camp have spotted Bernie twice, once in a tree and another time 6 months later on a trail. They said she was accompanied by a small cub about the size of a shoe. Bernie became a mother and hopefully continues to live her life as a free bear in her habitat. Life on the planet is all made of the same cells, from the same origin. We all share the same fundamentals, like the need to breathe, the thirst for life, or the instinct for reproduction. We are all meant to be free. Today, we do not tolerate slavery, and we proclaim that all human beings are born free and equal in rights and dignity. However, for all the other species on Earth, we accept unconditional deprivation of freedom and the absence of any rights. Time has come to have the nobility to acknowledge for all wildlife the fundamental right to a free and dignified life. We owe respect and compassion to those with whom we share the planet.
Karena masih gerakannya